Great. Okay. So I can always slip back if I need to, but hopefully the pace will be about right. I'm aiming to finish on time and to leave a few minutes at the end. If anyone's not in a rush to go off, I'm happy to stay on a bit longer, but I'm pretty good at going by the time. The only thing I'll warn you now is that at the o'clock, which is just over an hour and a quarter, you will hear a cuckoo probably going off. And that's my magic cuckoo clock, because I was given it as a present by my husband when we were in Dubai. And when we moved it over to Morocco, I changed the time so it keeps the Moroccan time, but the cuckoo won't stop doing Dubai cuckoos. So if you hear a lot of cuckoos going at 7 o'clock, you'll know why. That's my rebellious cuckoo clock that does its own thing. So you can I'll give it a moment to finish and then we'll continue. But I haven't found a way of stopping it and getting it to do Moroccan cuckoo clock time. So this is obviously a webinar, and our focus is on CBT, and particularly looking at how CBT can be very useful for depression and for grieving and loss. And goodness knows, over the last year and a half or so that we've all been living through, a lot of huge amounts of mental health problems been going on in the home, in relationships, in terms of kids, their relationship to school, in working from home, isolation. I could speak all evening about that, but I'm not going to. But how CBT could be helpful in that situation. And our strapline is positive psychology in action, because as I referred to before, our concern in Transformations Institute is to actually take what works, what's the best, what's the newest, what's the best of the ancient wisdom, what's the best of the latest research in neuroscience, and to make it practical so that ordinary everyday people, even if they don't know lots of jargon of psychology or anything, can actually make sense of it and apply it to themselves. So this is a crowded slide. It's simply there to show you that we have many accreditations. So when people ask me things like, well, are you KHDA or are you this, that, and the other? Actually, we're not really interested in local accreditations, because KHDA only does up to a certificate. And the least of what we do, introductory level OK certificate, but most of what we do is diploma, either professional practitioner diplomas, the ones that go on for 2 years, or the short courses for people who are already working in the field. So they have already got an entry level qualification, but they're wanting to add to what they do. You'll see most of them are UK based. There are a few, that one's from Canada, the Canadian Counsellors and Psychotherapists Association, and NLP, because the original creator of NLP, Richard Bandler, is based in the States, so that comes from the States. But most of the other stuff you're looking at there is from UK, or it's an international, like the International Council of Psychotherapists. So we this seriously, the question of standards, because the problem in the Middle East is it's relatively new, education, higher and further education. I know this partly because we spent the first 2 years we were living in the Middle East in Bahrain, setting up the first private university for women, the Royal University for Women. And we discovered very quickly that there really wasn't a lot of understanding. They knew, words like psychotherapist or psychiatrist and counselor and so on, but very few people, I'm talking ministries and government bodies and so on, really didn't have much of a clue about how things worked in other parts of the world. So this is just to reassure you that we do work to these professional world-class standards. And also, you don't have to take my word for it, but we have been assessed that way by our peers. We're multiple award winning, and out of the whole bunch of schools, training schools and institutes around the world, of which there are many, we've actually won twice an award, for example, called School of the Year. And that's based on the quality and the quantity of the graduates that we've trained, most of which have been in the Middle East for, as I said, most of the last 20 years. So that's us receiving our award outside the Ritz, showing off a bit there in London, from Terence Watts, who's now actually retired from the many years. He founded the APHP, and he ran a very successful long-term training school in the Essex, and he's still working, but he's working on one particular area rather than in general, author of many books and so on. So this is us with our award. Okay, so over to you now. I want to know what you think about this. If we look at this long list I've got here of people who work in the field of what we might call mental health or well-being, we've got psychiatrists, mental health psychiatric nurse, we've got various different kinds of psychologists, clinical, educational, health, organizational. We've got psychotherapists, we've got hypnotherapists, we've got counselor, That could be an advisory counsellor, like an academic counsellor, or a therapeutic counsellor, one who works in the field. And they're actually very different approaches, but a lot of people don't really know what's the difference between one type of counsellor and another. Most schools have got some kind of counsellor or pastoral staff, someone who's done some extra training. They might be a teacher, but they've also done some counselling training. And then, of course, we've got many people who work in the field in social and community work. And in the last, particularly in the last 40 odd years, this profession of coaching, which has started out as something only people did in sports. And since 1972, when Tim Galway wrote the book, The Inner Game, which was about tennis, a whole development in the field of using applications of coaching in the fields of both executive and corporate life, and life coaching, health coaching, etc. So we do get an awful lot of people who've got a coaching background who come to us for more in-depth psychological training in particular kinds of therapy. And what I want to say is that all of these people here can incorporate CBT into their work, but why do you think I put an asterisk by the first one? What's the difference between a psychiatrist and anyone else on that list? Who would like to volunteer their opinion on that?
Isn't it because they can like give medicine?
Yeah, so absolutely. What is the difference between a psychiatrist and anyone else on this list here? What do they have to train? What qualifications do they have before they can become a psychiatrist?
A psychiatrist has to go through med school and is a licensed doctor. Absolutely.
And I mention this because many people, and the people that come on our webinars and so on, are generally pretty well educated and smart people, but many people don't understand the difference between a psychiatrist and a psychologist, particularly a clinical psychologist. Now, as you quite rightly say, a psychiatrist has to be a medical doctor, so they have to do their MD, be it 3 or 4 years, depending on which part of the world they are. Once they've trained as a doctor of medicine, then they decide whatever their field is, what they're going to specialize in. A psychiatrist actually decides to specialize in mental, well, I'm going to say mental health. You'll see that there are some concerns about whether we're using that term health correctly when we're talking about psychiatry. And of course, the mental health psychiatric nurse is also medically qualified, but as a nurse and not as a doctor or psychiatrist. So they may well give out medication that the doctor has prescribed, that the psychiatrist prescribed, but they wouldn't be able to prescribe it themselves. Now, apart from psychiatrists, who else can prescribe medication? And I'm not just talking about any old kind of medication, but specifically the kind of medication that gets prescribed for many different kinds of psychiatric or psychological issues. Do you know? Do I have to have done my 7 years of my med school and then my specialism, my consultancy, etc., to become a fully fledged consultant psychiatrist? Do I have to have done that in order to prescribe medication? It's okay, you've got a 50-50 chance of getting it right or wrong.
I would say yes. You have to be a doctor.
Yeah, a doctor, but any kind of doctor, right? So your GP, technically, I'm not saying they would, though many do, can actually prescribe you what we would call psychotropic medication, medication that is intended for people with emotional and mental health difficulties. And so that means that an awful lot of people don't actually get any kind of assessment, psychiatric assessment or otherwise. They go to their doctor, they tell them about certain symptoms they're having, how they're feeling, and they will go away out of that surgery with a prescription for a psychotropic medication. Now, in the last, again, I don't know how many of you followed the field or are interested in the field, but in the last 50 years or so, there has been a huge, huge change in what psychiatry actually is and what it does. Because what does a psychiatrist mostly do? And a lot of people say, well, they study people and they study people who are unwell, have mental problems, and they get to know all about them and what kind of treatment to use. What do they actually do most of their time of? Anyone know? Once you've come out in med school, you decided on doing your psychiatric training, and that's what you're going to specialize in. Do you know what you spend most of your time doing?
Research?
Nope. I mean, some might do some research, but that's not necessary, and it's not part of the training.
Brain scans, maybe?
Some might do some brain scans. They might be interested particularly in the looking at brains and what brains do. Where would they likely to be if they're not in a lab doing research or doing brain scans in a brain scan facility? What would they be likely to be doing? Where would they likely to be based? Not one you've thought about?
Yeah,
Go
they
ahead.
might be like interested in different type of cases, and they might want to analyze those things and want to check like okay, these are the new problems and new things people encounter, and this is not one thing. Like every case is different and everything needs different medicine. Maybe that's what they do.
So that would be a very optimistic wish. If I tell me if you're surprised or not. I can't see all of your faces while I have the slide on. I can just see a few, and mostly names and not so much the faces. If I tell you that the majority of the time what a psychiatrist does is learn something like over 400 conditions that are now listed in something called the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. There's some countries have different names, but essentially it's the same material, the same information. So what those manual, that very thick manual, started out the first time probably less than 100 years ago or so, collecting and looking at a few different mental health problems and issues that people have. But if I tell you that now that the whole focus of psychiatry in, as I said, the last sort of 50 years and less has been on one thing only, and that's been to look at what are the list of mental health problems listed in these manuals. And guess who puts the manuals together? Guess who actually tells you what you need to do if someone comes under this condition or that cluster? They have a schizoid condition, they're borderline personality disorder, they're bipolar, they're this, that, and the other. As I said, there's now over 400 different conditions. Sometimes they change, sometimes they get taken out, not very often. Lots of new ones get put in. So where do they get the information? One of you said very hopefully research. Well, no, they don't. So if they don't get it from their own research or from universities and psychology departments and so on studying, where do they get the information from that tells them what they need to do with people who present with various different kinds of symptoms? What do you think?
Please don't say pharmaceutical companies.
Absolutely.
Oh,
so
God.
the pharmaceutical company, and again, you don't have to take my word for it. You might think I'm just a weird old bat, but I've spent my entire life researching these things, both as a practitioner and also as an academic, as a dean in a UK research-based university. I'm looking right now at shelves and shelves of books by academics, by researchers, including psychiatrists, who are saying things like why psychiatry makes things worse, not better, how psychiatry is not a real science, how psychiatry is actually basically based on profit, that the pharmaceutical companies tell people this is what you've got. They find a drug and they basically find a condition that they then sell the drug for. And anyone, I don't know if any of you have, I've worked with many people who've worked in the pharmaceutical industry. Many of them actually leave because they can't cope with the ethics of it. Most med schools, after someone's qualified as a doctor, the conferences they go to, all the things that they go to find out about their topic, to get wise, to be trained and to find out more, are actually funded by the pharmaceutical industry, which has absolutely no clear ethical interest. It is all about profit making. So I mention this to you because it's a huge problem, because the public has pretty much been sold this. It's the normal media response. If someone has a problem, it's a problem in their brain. And one of you mentioned brain scans. It's their brain chemistry. Or do you know that there isn't a single piece of research, double-blind, properly peer-reviewed research, that shows and demonstrates conclusively that there's anything to do with brain chemistry that causes mental health problems, except in an absolutely tiny, tiny number of people. It's the other way round, and this is a biggie. This is why I'm going on a bit with this slide. It's because our behavior, our thoughts, our feelings, what we focus on moment by moment, day by day, that's what creates our brain chemistry and the changes in our brain chemistry. And there are many really good books and good experiments and research showing that when you change people's behavior, if you encourage people to change their thoughts, their feelings, and understand how their brain works, actually they get better. And they not only get better, but it lasts because now they understand themselves. If you give them medication, it might temporarily make them better. In some cases, it will make them worse. And in some cases, it will make them very much worse. And over time, these medications are very dangerous because they affect things like the brain, the production of serotonin and other hormones in the brain. They cause brain lesions in some cases. Things like Prozac, very, very popular, given out like Smarties. It causes heart enlargement. Over time, these medications are very dangerous. And yet, do you know, and this is one of the last questions I'll put to you on this because I've taxed you a bit to think about this. Okay, what do you think? How do you think a condition that gets to be in there amongst that 400 plus conditions, how does it get in there? How do we decide that it goes in there? And by the way, I'm all for democracy and voting and all the rest of it, but when it comes to science, I'd like to see some evidence and not just the crowds influencing each other. And I want to see solid evidence that can be replicated over and over. So where do you think, how do you think those conditions get to be in there? Let's have a guess from one of you at least.
Well, would you say it's the lobbying of the pharmaceutical companies or the government?
That goes on in the background, just in terms of the process. So you know the due process. There is an annual meeting of the American and British and other psychiatric associations and psychological associations around the world. Some people are obviously better known than others. They get research grants, they've written more books, they've got to be well known. And what they do is that they listen to people putting an opinion about whether something should be added or not. Occasionally they take things out. For example, they took out homosexuality a few years ago because it was in there as a mental health condition, an illness. But the problem was there were a lot of gay psychiatrists and psychologists who kept demonstrating and lobbying. And so eventually they took it out. But to get a new one in there or get the name changed and have it redescribed, it's done by voting. So the people on the committee get together and they decide what sounds convincing. And as you quite rightly say, yes, there's lots and lots of lobbying going on in the background by the pharmaceutical industry. And that's how they decide something's in there. So I'll just give you a couple of examples, just so you know just how foolish the whole thing is really, when you just look at it with normal critical thinking eyes. So what do you think, let's see, hypergraphia. What do you think hypergraphia might mean? I diagnose you, you've got hypergraphia. Do you know what that means?
No.
Anyone guess by breaking the words down into hyper and graphia?
Like something with writing, too much writing or too many words?
Yeah.
Or...
So hypergraphia means you write a lot. But that's a mental health condition. That's an illness, right? So Shakespeare, Dickens, whichever tradition you come from, your culture, people who write a lot, that's a mental health condition. You have a child, right? A child who loves being outdoors, playing. They've been driven crazy this last year by having to stay indoors, not going out and doing the sports they normally do. They don't like to sit still for ages because they're very physical and they're very talented, very well coordinated. But you put them in a classroom and you sit them down and you tell them you have to learn this, that, and the other. You need to learn these facts. This is what education's for. And they get very restive and they start messing around, mucking about. And what do they get labeled nowadays? Very popular label.
ADHD.
Yeah, ADHD, ADD or ADHD, attention deficit hyperactive disorder. And I saw once, one of our students once brought me a copy of the Reader's Digest from America, and it had a full-size ad. You know, it's an A5 booklet, that magazine, and it said, "Is your teen giving you trouble taking out the garbage and doing their chores? Call your doctor, book their appointment today," because it was either Ritalin or Adderall, will sort them out, etc., etc. So this labeling of normal human behavior, like you find your husband's cheating on you and you're brokenhearted, your child dies, an elderly pet that's been part of the family gets sick and has to be put down, you lose your job and you don't know how you're going to live. Okay, these are all things that go on normally in human life, and of course for the last year and a half have been going on big time for societies which haven't had to deal with this before, not for in recent years. So does that mean that there's something wrong with you, that you're sick, or does it mean that there's something wrong with the conditions? So this is why I'm explaining to you, it's a very different attitude that CBT and what we would call positive psychology takes in relation to all of these things. Yeah, you know, you can help people with lots and lots of things, but this is the problem with the model we're living with, is at the end of the day, people expect that they get given a pill to fix things, and then they'll be fixed because there's some sort of chemical imbalance in the brain, and that's not actually the fact. There's no sound evidence that that's the case whatsoever, and I'll talk a little bit later on about research. If anyone wants to challenge me on any of this, please do so. I'm very happy, and I'm also very happy to give you references for anyone who wants to educate themselves, because to me, especially the last, as I said, last 15, 20 years, I've made it a big thing as part of my research and my practical applied skills work to help people to understand they are not broken, they're not damaged, there's not something wrong with more than half the human race all expecting to get depressed and sick and so on. It's because the system is not working, the system is not a supportive system to human health and well-being. And that's the difference between the positive psychology approach and the many of the other approaches. So anyone has a question on that now, please ask. If not, then as I said, please feel free to ask me at the end. Okay, so I said to you I would talk a little bit about psychological approaches, and I'll keep this real simple. Okay, the very first approaches were people like Freud, who no doubt you've heard of, Melanie Klein, a whole bunch of people who got together at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century to look at what made people sick, unhappy mentally. And it's not an accident or a coincidence that Freud and many of the others he worked with initially were actually doctors, and they were neurologists. Neurologists, of course, study the human brain, the human nervous system, and it was assumed at this time that it was something to do with the nervous system that meant people went crazy. And in those days, they believed that if you went crazy, if you got mentally sick, there was nothing they could do about it except lock you up. And if you were wealthy, then you might get some privileges, you might be treated better. But if you look at some of the history of these things, it's horrendous. Put in cold baths, alternated with hot baths, given electric shocks, which is still being used, though the more sophisticated equipment, lock you up, put you in a straitjacket. It was pretty horrendous. And of course, anyone who was disturbed, upset, and so on, this is not a way that's going to make them well. And the very first, those of you who, nobody's mentioned hypnotherapy, but I sometimes do, because often people who've been to Illuminations have studied or have done some hypnotherapy. Actually, hypnotherapy was the very first of the psychological disciplines. It's why, to me, it's so strange that it's regarded as a bit flaky or a bit out there, because it was the very first. It was when the neurologists started looking, could we put people into a relaxed state that calmed them down and then help to understand what's going on with their emotional states and so on. So this first batch of doctors, and the ones that became known as psychiatrists and psychotherapists, were all people who actually studied people who were in mental hospitals. Then we had a phase during the first part of the 20th century where we had a more scientific approach rather than Freud's theories from Greek myths about the human psyche. They said, we want to observe people, and they did a lot of observation of animals too, and these were the early behaviorists and what we now call behavioral psychology. I'll come back to them shortly, but we have Pavlov and we have Skinner. And you may have heard of Pavlov's experiments with dogs. So as I said, I'll come back to that one. Then around the middle of the 20th century, we started getting people like Abraham Maslow saying, hang on a minute, if we want to understand the human psyche, human emotions, human thoughts and feelings, what makes people unhappy or happy, why do we study people who are really sick and in a really bad way and often locked up in institutions, or they're in labs and we're observing them? Why don't we look at people who are well, who are functioning well, who manage to make life work, and watch what they do and have a look at what they do? So this is the beginning of what we nowadays call humanistic psychology or psychology of being. Let's find out what people do that they do it well. And those of you who've had any coaching or done any coaching will know that's the premise of coaching. Let's start out not by looking at what's wrong with you, but what do you do well and what could you do better? How could you improve your potential? That's what coaching is about. Therapy is when you think you've got something wrong with you, and coaching is generally you don't think you've got anything too much wrong with you, but you'd like to improve your performance. And we're quite keen on combining elements of both in our work. And then you have Martin Seligman and his colleague, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, and there's a YouTube video on how you pronounce that name. And in 1998, Martin Seligman was elected as the head of the American Psychological Association, and he and others made a declaration to say, we believe in a psychology of the human mind that encourages people to be well, to be healthy and thrive, not basically to look for what's wrong with them. And I'll come back to that in a moment in more detail here. So a psychology of positive human functioning will arise, achieving a scientific understanding, not what the drug companies try to sell us or what somebody's latest theory is, but effective interventions to build thriving communities, families, and individuals. And they produced that in 1998, and we're now looking at about 30 years on, with a huge amount of research for the first time ever done on things like happiness and success and luck and well-being, rather than looking on, you know, damage to the psyche, trauma to the psyche. Now, I'm not saying the psyche doesn't suffer trauma and there aren't things we need to help people with, but the focus is on what's well with people. What could they do better? How could they help themselves? Let's build on the positive side of their personality. And that's where there's a huge difference between CBT and the old psychological Freudian therapies, etc. So just to briefly go, as I said, I'm not going to read all the slides, but I want you to know the difference. This comes from ancient roots. This comes from Greco-Roman philosophy. And we have two main kinds of approach to reasoning and inquiry. One is inductive, where you look down and chunk down. If you've done any NLP, you might have heard that phrase, chunk down. Look to the specifics before you generalize. Whereas the other way around, the deductive, is to actually look general and then to start chunking down. So in the CBT approach, we want to get right down to the very specific facts. So if someone says, oh, I'm so unhappy, I can't cope with people and social situations. We don't accept that as being a given. We say, okay, in which particular social situations do you feel uncomfortable? Which particular people do you feel uncomfortable around? When did you first notice this started to happen? So we start to get very specific, and some people even refer to it as forensic, to find out what exactly is going on, rather than making these big generalizations. Oh, I can't cope, I'm useless, I'm terrible, I'm rubbish, I just can't cope. This also links to Stoic philosophy, which is again one of the old Greek philosophies. And nowadays, the fashionable term for it in positive psychology is resilience. The idea of being resilient and coping with stress, coping with loss, coping with even horrendous situations, but learning how to find that you can do that without giving up on yourself and saying, that's it, I'm broken, I need to be fixed, bring in the doctor, bring in the drugs, bring in the electroshock treatment. Mindfulness meditation techniques have been incorporated increasingly in recent years into this approach, and in the most recent versions of CBT are actually known sometimes as MBCT, mindfulness-based cognitive behavioral therapy. And someone called John Kabat-Zinn, who any of you might have done any mindfulness or meditation, may have heard of him. He's been a leading light for many years in meditation and using meditation as stress reduction. And there is actually a master's course at Oxford University in the UK, which teaches CBT incorporating Buddhist mindfulness techniques. And when I say Buddhist, by the way, I'm talking about philosophy and psychology. I'm not talking about religion, because it's a big mistake. Most people don't know, because they talk about Buddhism being the major world religion. It's not a religion. It doesn't have a God. It doesn't have a belief system in all sorts of things. It's about working out your own way of doing things and getting wisdom from teachers and masters to do that, but not to worship a particular guru or God or one only. So it can fit in with whatever religion you are, whether you're an atheist or whether you're a Hindu or a Muslim, Christian, it really doesn't matter. You can incorporate these techniques into your own personal belief system because they're techniques. That's all they are, techniques. We have the latest version of it's called DBT, Dialectical Behavioural Therapy. And if you've come across something called acceptance commitment therapy, this is very similar. It's the idea that CBT puts a lot of emphasis on change and changing positively, but DBT says, you know what, when someone's had a hard time or they've spent years and years feeling negative, feeling unhappy, not being able to cope, then they need to come to a state of acceptance about where they are and who they are in order sometimes to make that change and move forward. So Marsha Lynham, who developed this, has worked a lot with what is referred to as borderline personality disorder and more extreme forms of mental health problems, what gets labeled schizophrenia and so on. And she's developed this dialectical approach of acceptance combined with change. So if we look at one of these Buddha quotes, we are what we think, all that we arises with our thoughts, and with our thoughts we make the world. And this is in fact very much about what CBT is all about. Now I said I'd come back to these original guys. Pavlov looked at conditioned responses. Anyone remember his famous experiment, what animal he did it with? Anyone come across that? I'm sure the two psychology students have heard of it.
Dogs.
Yeah, what did he do with those poor dogs?
Oh, he trained them, if I remember correctly, to conditional, what's it called? I can't remember. To salivate when they hear the noise. I think so. I might be confusing it.
No, you're not completely wrong at all. It's a great image, isn't it? So what he did was, as you said, trained. In other words, he created a conditioned response in the dogs that when they were brought food, then a bell was rung just before they were given the food. So they learned to associate the ringing of a bell with giving them their dinner, giving them their food. And after he'd done that for a bit so that their conditioned responses were very well established, then he started bringing in the bell, ringing the bell, and with no food, and the dogs still produced the saliva. And he devised all sorts of weird devices to measure how much saliva they produced. Essentially, they'd been conditioned into expecting that they would eat when they heard the bell. And of course, once we're expecting to eat, we produce saliva. So he had a look at dogs doing this. Skinner was actually more extreme than Pavlov. Pavlov was he won a Nobel Prize for Physiology for his work with animals. Skinner was something else. Skinner was what he called a radical atheist. He believed that people's responses to things like prayer, ritual, religion was the same as conditioned responses in animals. And he set out to prove it by experimenting with, I don't know if you came across this, again, the psychology students amongst you. He actually wrote a book called The Religious Behavior of Pigeons. You know, pigeons, the birds. And so he did much the same as Pavlov did, but what he did was he waited until the pigeons started making certain movements. You know, pigeons often go around pecking, 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 looking for food, looking for seeds. And when they did certain kinds of pecking movements, then he released seed through the chute. And after a bit, the pigeons would come to the chute and they would make those movements in order to get fed, expecting to get fed. And then he stopped feeding them, but they still did it. And what he said is that's what people do. When people go and pray, they go to church and they do rituals and rain dances and all the rest of it. All they're doing is doing something that happened to maybe make an association at some point, and now they believe that they're actually creating it happening by their behavior. So he was very skeptical about anything to do with religion or spirituality. And what we think is useful is that he took an inductive data-driven approach. He observed things, but he already had a very fixed mindset about what was and wasn't possible for the human psyche. And unfortunately, the sorts of people that loved him are the sorts of people that we're working across the world now, the people who are conditioning through the media, who are taking money, so-called fact checkers from vested interests, and then telling you this is wrong. There's a whole science of PR being used. And who loved him? I wonder if you can guess who loved him. Look at when he was working around the middle of the 20th century. Who do you think was a big fan of Skinner when it came to politicians and how we might control populations? Anyone guess? It's all right, you can say whatever you like. It's just, might be true, might not be. Which politicians? And of course it's happening now too, but we look back, sometimes it's safer to look from a distance. What was happening around the 30s and 40s in the world at the time that might make it very convenient to be able to get people to follow what they're told, to follow orders, to do what they're being asked to do on a massive scale, never done before. that we have in recorded history anyway. So who do you think really loved his kind of approach to psychology? Controlling crowds, controlling human behavior, conditioning them to respond to certain things. Think of symbols, think of flags, think of all sorts. Who might have been a fan of his, do you think?
World War II.
The Nazis, right? Goebbels and
Adolf
Goering.
Hitler.
Yeah, Hitler. And then we look at Russia, we look at any totalitarian regimes, and sadly, and again, I'm not going to go on about it, but you do your own follow-up, and I'm always happy to send people links. The same thing exactly is going on right now to condition us to do things that have absolutely no sense to them whatsoever and are totally against the science, but we're told, follow the science. So it's quite scary to me as a social scientist and as a psychologist of many years standing in research and practically working with people, to see people being conditioned into changing their responses by using these kinds of mass influence, the mass influence on human behavior. It's going on right now in the media. So we have a few other people who had a bit more of a positive approach, who developed things like assertiveness training. Any of you who've done EFT, I don't know if any of you've done emotional freedom techniques, tapping, meridian therapies, learning how to actually assess the SUDS meter, your subjective unit of discomfort. These guys said, look, we know these things are true, that you can condition people, but let's encourage people to recondition themselves, not just do it because governments or cultures or societies are telling them to, but for them to understand themselves and the way that they tick. So actually, this is where behaviorism started having a much more positive applications, you could say. And these are the two guys you need to know about if you want to know about the history of it, and especially those of you studying psychology who come across CBT, and I know at least one of you's had some CBT as a modality to work with therapeutically. Here's what's interesting. These guys, both American, but both very different backgrounds, okay? Ellis was the older, so we call him the grandfather of CBT. And Beck, who, by the way, is 100. I think I might have his dates in there somewhere, but anyway, he's 100 now, and he's still going. He's still research active, a bit frail, and his daughter runs the Beck Research Institute. Now, these guys didn't know each other. One trained as a psychologist, and one trained as a psychiatrist. Both of them wanted to help people. They were very driven by motivation to help people to enjoy their lives, to be happier, to be better. Beck worked a lot with people with depression, and Ellis did too, but both of them decided that what they learned as a psychologist and as a psychiatrist didn't really help them to help people. So they both went and studied psychoanalytic therapy so that they became psychoanalysts, okay? Not together, not the same schools, didn't know each other, but within a very short time, both came to the point of view that Freudian analysis did not help make people better. They understood their hang-ups more. They understood a bit more sometimes about their background, their psyche, their family background, but they didn't know how to change their thoughts, how to change their feelings and their behavior. And both of them came to that, and they both came up with different labels for it. Ellis came up with what he called rational therapy, then rational emotive behavioral therapy, and Beck called what he did cognitive therapy. Study these things, you will know that they're pretty much similar, and some of them even exactly the same sorts of techniques. So it's really interesting to see that both working independently, trying to find ways to help people, realize people need to have more active and directive involvement in their therapy. Their therapist needs to help them to work out some different things to do, to challenge the way that they're thinking, to challenge the way that they're feeling, to actually change their negative thought patterns and thus change their negative emotions. And the Beck, working in psychiatry, worked more with clinical cases, so he's worked quite a lot with people labeled as schizophrenic. And somebody thought it'd be a good idea to get these two guys together because they seem to have so much in common with the way that they were developing their own systems independently. And sadly, it didn't turn out to be what they wanted. They both decided great to collaborate and to share their work. And they got them together for a discussion with an audience, and they decided it'd be really good to start collaborating. But sadly, Ellis died shortly after this, and so that never happened. But Beck, as I said, is still going strong. And here is the common features that they both had, right? Focusing on the here and now, not spending all your time on the past. looking forward to the future, the therapist having a guidance and a structured guidance role where they help the client by structuring the sessions and the path, not telling them what to think or do, but encouraging them to challenge their thoughts and their feelings and their responses, and getting the patients, in the case of a doctor or in the case of a psychologist, a client, to feel so much better about having more control over what's going on between their ears and in the rest of their body too. So here's what's known as the cognitive behavioral triad. Thoughts, what we think, affects how we feel and how we act. Emotions, how we feel, affects what we think and what we do, and our behavior, what we do, affects how we think and feel. So can you see this isn't a static model that just goes one way, it's a two-way. So thoughts affect behavior, behavior affects thoughts, behavior affects emotions, emotions behave. So this is a dynamic model that's going on all the time in our heads. The only thing is we don't learn about it. We don't really know what to do about it. I'm just seeing who's in the chat room there. Okay. Okay, no, nothing new. Right, so in cognitive behavioral therapy, lovely, simple model, but very, very effective. Don't be fooled by the simplicity of it. I mean, it's great that it's simple so anyone can understand it, but it's very powerful. Everything goes on in our mind. So that's our memories, our images, our thoughts, our attention, everything that we've gathered in our mind and our experiences over the years. Our behavior is everything we do. And that's not only what we say and how we act, but also how we avoid action, how we procrastinate, how we put things off, and how we go about solving problems. And is it effective or not? Does it work or not? And therapy, of course, is a systematic approach to health and well-being by helping people to overcome a problem, illness, or irregular condition. And the central concept of CBT is we feel the way that we think and we act accordingly. This is very powerful. Now, I want to bring this up because this is a very important part of CBT in terms of motivation. See, you could send your child or your friend or encourage someone to go off, have therapy. Look, you know, you've got problems. But motivation comes from two sources. One, extrinsic. From where's extrinsic? Where's that coming from? If we've got extrinsic motivation, what's the motivation?
Outside. Exterior.
Yeah, the outside, right. Another way of putting that is carrots and sticks. I don't have the, I had some pictures, but they seem to have dropped off. Okay, so you can punish people. You can say, wear masks or you'll get a fine or you'll lose your job or whatever. So that's a punishment, a stick. Reward, okay, you'll be allowed to go to movies or travel or various things, whether you are actually or not when it comes to it, but that's extrinsic, right? That's what someone else is telling you from the outside. Is that generally the best way to get long-term change to happen, in your opinion? If you don't do your homework, you get grounded, okay? If you do your homework, then you'll get to watch the computer or the TV for a while, okay? How well do those sorts of strategies work on the long term? Any of you parents here?
I can say these things doesn't go well in a long run, and they can actually change what actually we think, and it can actually make it worse if
Absolutely.
It doesn't go well.
Kids can get very good at manipulating, can't they? They can learn how to lie, they can learn how to cover up. They do what they do because they want to do it. Mostly, however, this is operant conditioning. You do it because you're conditioned from the outside. And on the intrinsic side, obviously, if this is from the outside, this is your internal process, your internal desire to change. And we have an old joke in the world of therapy. I don't know if any of you've ever heard it. It says, how many therapists does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer to the joke is only one, but the light bulb has to really want to change. In other words, if people want to change, they have to have some kind of motivation to change. And that comes from the inside. So that comes from their thoughts, from their feelings, and from how they act on their thoughts and feelings. If you haven't seen that word before, it's conation. It means how you act on your thinking and feeling. Now, we know there are other things. There's your biology. There are things that may be outside your control in terms of your gene structure and biology. Some of that might just be given, fair enough. Spiritual is outside the realm of CBT. We don't really know. We can have a belief, we can have a faith, and that's fine. It keeps people going. We know it certainly has a good effect in terms of optimism and positivity, but we've got no scientific evidence for it, right? But here's the thing where there's an overlap between the two. And again, I put it to you that in the last year and a half, we've seen a huge amount of this going on, which is, this is one that's shared by both. And if you remember Maslow, I showed you in one of the earlier slides, his pyramid of needs. If you've seen that, again, the psychology students will have seen this. At the bottom, the need we've all got is to survive, right? We need food, we need shelter, we need to be able to physically survive. Then it goes up the pyramid, and we have the need to belong, the need to belong to a group, to a family or a social structure we want to be approved of. We want status, we want to be respected, we want to have some respect for what we do from others. And at the top of the pyramid, we have what he calls self-actualization. And that's the one that comes from deep inside us, the desire to be fulfilled, to do the best we can. And no one else can make us have that. They can encourage us, but we have to have that. We have to find that for ourselves. So here's the problem. If we want other people's approval, and we want other people not to social shame us, not to call us nutcases or this, that, and the other. I mean, the amount of insults and deeply disturbing things that I'm seeing about colleagues of mine that are Nobel Prize winners, people who are the top researchers and scientists of the last century, some of them being vilified because they're not playing the party game as far as the whole pandemic thing goes. And that to me is very disturbing, because then when you get people doing things because of wanting to be approved of, that actually mean that they have to deny the evidence of their senses or what they found out from their research. This is where it gets to be really spooky. And so I mentioned this in relation to therapy, because cognitive behavioral therapy, if you're going to do it properly, you can't just pretend. Once you open up your critical thinking skills, you need to take it through. Is it possible? Is it probable? Is it likely? Against, it's pro, or it's conspiracy. I mean, come on, we're talking about using the human brain to apply science and logic and reason, and then come up with our best opinions and discuss it and debate it. I think it's called free speech and opinion, and we're in a scary time as far as that goes. So I mention this because as a therapist, you can't do this work with people, in my opinion, cognitive behavioral therapy, without getting people to question some of the things that they're being told, thinking for themselves. What they decide is entirely their choice. It's not your job as a therapist to tell them what to think, but it is important that you help them to educate themselves about what's going on. So here's the final bit of how the model works. We represent our experience of life into jargon words, self-schema, basically a well-developed concept of who we are. And that comes from our experiences and our interpretation of those experiences. So each of us has a self-schema for the particular domains that are personally important to us, for which we have well-developed concepts. So here a person says, I'm friendly, I'm a people person. Someone else says, I don't trust others and I'm shy. And we organize and direct the processing of all the information that we get through these schemata as what CBT calls packages of self-knowledge. Now, does that mean that this is black and white? Well, no, that's why I put it in color. So I'm friendly and I'm a people person. That's great, isn't it? If you're working in situations where you need to interact a lot with people, you're a hostess of social events, you need to put people at ease, you need to make people feel comfortable, great. Then on the other hand, what if you're one of those people, you're friendly and a people person, but you give people no space? I think they're called helicopter parents, hovering around all the time. Checking out all the time, not giving anyone any space to breathe. Is everything okay? Are you okay? Very intrusive, not allowing anyone any space. They're, that person's just too much. So you've got the same images that they've got of themselves. I'm friendly and I'm a people person, but one of them might be a very positive way of behaving. Other might be dysfunctional, might not be the best way. And the same thing, I don't trust others, I'm shy. Well, some people might say, oh, well, that's going to give you social phobia and you won't get to go out and get married. Yeah, but what if it turns out that person used to wear their heart on their sleeve and they got ripped off? They were very trusting, they were very naive, and unscrupulous people, nasty people took advantage of them. So they have a good reason to be cautious and careful. Useful, what's functional, what works for you and what doesn't. And when Beck looked at research and the correlation between the severity of people becoming depressed, having a very negative evaluation of themselves, and pessimism, he found that firstly, there was a very strong correlation, a strong link between a negative view of one's future and the negative view of the self. And this fits in with what we were talking about with the cognitive triad in depression: a negative view of the situation, a negative view of the self, and a negative view of the future. And the research that's been done since then has actually found this isn't just correlation, it's causation. We find it every single time we look at someone. If they have a negative view of their own self, if they have a negative view that the future can't be any better than the past, and in fact it's probably going to be worse, and they have a feeling that the situation can't get any better, then it's very difficult for them to get out of it without structured interventionist therapy. And so, sorry, I'll just skip to page. Okay, so the purpose of the CBT is to identify what thoughts are you having, not judging them, they're good, they're bad, but what are the thoughts? Just practically, what are the thoughts you have? What are the emotions that go with those thoughts? And what's the behavior that you tend to do when you have that feeling or when you have that thought? And then to test them against reality. Not saying it's right or it's wrong, but how likely is it? How probable is it? Is it just a possibility or is it likely? Okay, so CBT gets clients to do that, to start challenging how rational, how accurate are my thought processes. And if they're not verifiable, or they're not accurate, or they're partially true but partially untrue, then CBT seeks to change the dysfunctional automatic thoughts into more rational and realistic ones. And it does this with a series of very practical exercises. For example, making a note through a journal or filling in sheets of your emotional states each day. What things trigger negative thoughts, negative feelings? Any particular person, any particular time of day, any situation? And to start keeping activity schedules so that you can start to get a more realistic idea. Is it true I'm depressed all of the time? I never feel relief, I never feel happy. And sometimes people will say things like that. They'll say, yeah, that's me. And I'll say, okay, so how about you're in the shopping mall and you suddenly desperately
Can we hear anything?
Oh, I think she fell off.
Oh yeah, right.
my connection went down and it's back now. So I hope you all got me now.
Yeah, got it.
Good. Okay, great. I hope everyone's back with us now. Yeah, okay. So the clients are, as I said, might be saying to me, I'm never ever happy. I never feel relief. It just goes on. And I give them example, as I was just saying, you're in the mall, you need to go to the bathroom urgently, and you realize it's right the other way down there. It's a long walk, and you go trotting along as quickly as you can, and you finally get there, you get in the cubicle, and you get to have a pee, and you think, oh. And I said, so you're really depressed at that point in time. Now, they might laugh at me and say, don't be silly. I'm talking about the fact that people talk in black and white, in yes or no, on or off, and that's not our experience of life. Some things will make us feel happy. Even in the middle of being depressed, we'll start to salivate at some food that we like. Other times, maybe we're off our food because we feel too down. Then the weather changes maybe, and something else happens. So what I'm saying here is to just keep checking daily what exactly are the triggers, what helps and what doesn't. So if we just take an example here of what's useful thinking, not wrong or right thinking, but useful or not. So here someone has the thought, I'll never have a good job. And so they feel hopeless. What are they likely to do when it comes to getting a job? If they believe and are saying to themselves over and over, I'll never have a good job, I feel hopeless. What happens? or what doesn't happen. Are they likely to start looking at HR availability? Are they going to start looking at where there are vacancies? Are they going to start approaching job hunting agencies? Are they going to submit CVs? Are they going to make phone calls? What do you think? Come on.
I think we should.
Well, I think they won't be very motivated.
You're not going to be motivated, right? And if I give you in a contrast, my granddaughter's husband, he just changed jobs. He's very successful in computing world. He just changed jobs with shares and everything for a big new starter, well, a company that had started but now expanding. After starting the job, I think 2-3 weeks after starting the job, he was told he was redundant because the investments they were expecting hadn't come through. Now, suppose he'd said to himself, oh, I'll never have a good job. I've just given up the other one to take this one. Now how am I going to pay the mortgage? How are we going to look after the kids? Do you know, within 2 days, he had 15 interviews. Now, okay, he's fortunately in a field where his skills are needed. But I'm telling you now, from knowing that individual, that personality, he would have kept going, kept going, kept going. In fact, within a week, he had a consultancy role for a 3-month contract while he's looking to see what else he wants to do. His thought is, I'll have a good job. I'll always be able to find a good job. There'll be a way for me to make it work, even if it seems difficult. So his attitude is one of, I'll find a way. Now, here's a person who's lonely, who feels that they can't make relationships work, or it's just not going to happen. So they have a feeling, nobody likes me. They feel unlovable. And so their internal feelings, their emotions are lonely and rejected. So what does that mean when it comes to accepting social invitations, getting together with friends, going out and about, being active? What are they likely to do? Being lonely and rejected. Come on. You give me your idea.
Yeah, they're not going to go out for sure.
Exactly. They refuse the invitation. What's the point in going out? Nobody's going to like me. Nobody's going to talk to me when I get there. I'm boring. I've got nothing to say. So they withdraw. Okay. I'm just giving you very simple examples that happen to people on a day-by-day basis. And so suddenly you'll have someone who was doing okay, and within a matter of weeks or months, suddenly down into a depression, down into a state of feeling stuck and grieving, feeling they'll never be able to get back their mojo. Now, here's the thing. See, this person is not saying, I'm bound to get a good job. I'm always successful. Everybody loves me. But what do they say? They say, I have solved problems before. I found ways to make life work. This is what I was talking about when it comes to resilience, to building up that resilience. Because people who sweat the small stuff are the ones who tend to fall apart when the big stuff happens. The ones who actually manage to cope with it, who deal with it, who don't make everything into a big disaster, are the ones who actually pull through, even when they have to deal with the most horrendous kind of trauma, which many people do in their lives. And so, of course, we know a good way to start life is to have parents who love you and are appreciative and interact with you and encourage you. But even if you didn't have those kind of parents, it doesn't mean that you're stuck forever. And I often say to my therapy clients, if you're 40 years old, worse 50, but let's say 40 years old, and you're still blaming your parents and your family for your problems, it's time to grow up and become a healthy adult, because you can't do anything about what happened in the past. What you can do is about what's happening now in the present moment, and how you prepare for the future and what you learn from the past. So people who are carrying hopefulness and positivity tend to find ways forward. So again, I won't go into the detail, but what a therapist, CBT therapist does, and by the way, they can be using this with many other kinds of approaches as well, including hypnotherapy, etc. But they will use behavioral techniques, breathing, which is just about every kind of positive psychology, includes breath work. because breathing is what keeps us alive and gives us a feeling of energy and life energy. Daily activity schedules, because when we do things, when we physically do things, it changes our brain chemistry, it changes our hormonal system, it changes our neurology. Pleasure ratings, actually thinking about what do we enjoy and realistically assessing some things we might only get this much pleasure from, some might give us a lot of pleasure from. Let's start looking not at the things that make us only unhappy, but the things that make us feel happy. When you think of a certain face of someone you love, a small child, you know, think of all the puppies and kitten things, that's why they're so popular. And then to actually do experiments, including what we call controlled exposure, just a little bit of something and see if you can cope with it. Not throw yourself in at the deep end, but just on a day-by-day basis. And you know, it's surprising just how quickly, it's only a matter of weeks, a few months at the most, and people can turn around that response. The second stage is changing the program itself to start really noticing what are your negative automatically thoughts that you have, the errors in logic that depressed and distressed people normally make. And the therapist uses this questioning and guided discovery to get the person, the client, to challenge and rewrite the thoughts in a more balanced way. That's it, balance. I hope you can hear me. Oops. Just seem to lose the... Have we still got the gallery? Can you hear me? Oh, good. Okay, because it's, I don't know what's happened at my end, but it went very quiet and now I can't see your gallery. But if you can hear me, that's great. I'll keep going. Okay, so we need to change the program, and that takes about another 5 sessions. If you're just doing CBT alone, then 15 sessions to 20 sessions. If you're combining CBT with things like hypnotherapy, maybe using some NLP, some coaching strategies, other forms of approach, then you can manage with sometimes 5 to 10 sessions. And the guy that we work with, Dr. David Cato in the UK, he was known for getting fantastic results from just 6 sessions with people using a combination of CBT with hypnotherapy and NLP. So in the final stage, the client starts to become their own therapist. In other words, they start to notice for themselves, what was going through my mind just before I started to feel this way? And the client and the therapist together come up with a list of the core thinking errors, and the client starts to observe and reality test these as hypotheses rather than saying they're facts, okay? So then you can start coming up with alternative ways of thinking, and they're more balanced. And it doesn't mean you might not have difficult days and bad days, but it means that you have a more realistic way of looking at how things actually are. Now I'm just trying to get this, I don't know why it's doing this. Okay, I'll come out of the program in a minute because we're nearly done. Just wanted to say a couple of things about research. Please do take a note if you would like to have a look for yourselves. But in over 400 clinical trials, and it's probably well over more, CBT has been found with depression and with grieving, with loss, with deep, deep states of sadness and pain and suffering psychologically and emotionally, to change the brain chemistry without medication. And it is endorsed within the NHS and throughout the private sector. Throughout the world, most clinicians and the general public are saying, you know what, CBT works. And as I said, when I say clinical trials, I'm not talking about pharmaceutical company trials of their own, where they won't look at the raw data, where they fudge things. I'm talking about clinical double-blind trials where he demonstrated over and over again, including in more extreme conditions like borderline personality disorder, schizophrenia, etc. And just to give you a couple more bits, Toronto study of cognitive therapy versus pharmacotherapy, drugs in other words, used pre and post-treatment brain scans. Both found that the treatment changed the brain, but with the CT, and this is a big, big, interesting fact, the changes were top down. With the drugs, it was bottom out. In other words, given antidepressants, it affected the brain, but as soon as they were taken off the antidepressants, nothing had changed. Antidepressants simply dampen the activity in the limbic system, the emotional center of the brain, and the other way around, the CBT calms the activity in the cortex, which is the brain's seat of reason. So that means that there's far less state likelihood of relapse if someone's learned CBT, because they'll be able to apply it to themselves and start managing their state far more effectively. So as I was saying at the beginning, it's about helping people to become their own therapists and their own coaches and incorporating CBT into other modalities. Nobody said they're a hypnotherapist, so I'm not going to go through those two slides because they're specifically for people who are interested in the combination of the two. But what I will say is that the research shows that when you combine CBT, which works with the cognitive, rational, conscious mind, and hypnotherapy, which works with the subconscious mind, which is also a huge part of us, then we can actually get far better results. And all the research that's happened so far, we want to do more, shows that those two modalities in combination enhance the treatment outcomes in CBT therapy and the other way around in hypnotherapy. So CBT is very flexible. You can just look at some of the things it's used for there. And I would say, even though one of my specialisms is clinical hypnotherapy, that when it comes to eating disorders and OCD, that CBT combined with hypnotherapy is far more effective than hypnotherapy alone. That's what I and many others have found. But it's client-centered. It's for the client to actually still make their own decisions, not just be a victim of extrinsic motivation, but they do need to be motivated and be prepared to do the work. It's a 50-50 therapy. They need to go and do exercises, daily things that they're given to do, come back, see what progress they've made, how they've understood themselves. So it's very structured. Now, that's the last slide which I have, which is about the course we've got coming up. But I want to come out of the slideshow now so I can talk to you because, as I said, we had a problem with the Zoom connection there. So I'm back here now. Let's just put that one back on. Okay. And what's it doing then? I haven't had this particular one before, this Zoom where it seems like that. Okay, so I've done what I promised. We have 10 minutes or so within the time frame that we have. You can read that slide. If you've got any questions about it, you can ask me. If not, fine. But if you've got any other questions about anything I've asked, things related to you personally, or things in general that I've mentioned, please feel free to go ahead and ask. And I will either do my best to answer you now, or if I think it's something where it would be good for you to be referred to something, a particular book or a video or a paper of some sort, an article, I'm happy to follow up, but you would need to let me have your email address. And what I'll do while I'm talking to you actually now be a good thing to do that in the where's my chat box? Okay, let me just take this out. I don't know why it's not. Okay, well, if you have a problem, you can always check with Illuminations, but my personal email address is Dr. Leila, DRLEILA, @transforminst.com. And so, as I said, if you can't remember that, if I can't find a way for some reason, I have no idea why it's not letting me do it. Normally, it will just let me do this, and I will just put in the chat box. Let me see. I'm just seeing if I can find a way around it. No. Strange. Really, really weird. Okay, so please go ahead, and as I said, I will. I'm going to take out this altogether now if I can, so that I haven't got this getting in the way. Right. Just looking to see now if I can spread this out. Aha, yes, I've got chat now. Okay, so I'll put my email address in the chat box so that if any of you want to follow up with me. And my WhatsApp number is no longer my Dubai number. It's this number here, 212. Okay, so those are for you if anyone wants to contact me directly. But please, I'm very happy to answer any questions that any of you have, whether you're thinking of going on to do some professional training as per the last slide that I had, or whether just for yourself you're interested. I take on a few individual clients, not that many, but I can refer to many people that I have trained who are in the GCC region, who are good therapists and who've trained with me and passed their exams and done all of that. That's their okay, so you joined in well in the beginning. You've gone a bit quiet and shy now at the end. Nobody got any questions for me? Please.
I have a question.
Good, go ahead. What's your question?
Okay, so as I've learned, CBT includes like changing behavior, like whatever we think, and we just have to work on ourselves. What like is it like we doesn't function actually as an individual person? So does CBT also includes people involved in our lives? So is there a exercise or something for them also? In CBT.
First of all, that person in your life has to want to do the change as well. You know, for example, like with couples therapy, there's no point in having a couple in for couples therapy if only one of them wants to make their relationship work, is prepared to invest in it, and so on. What I do prefer to do generally with my CBT clients, and what I teach my CBT students to do, is to teach all sorts of other. Because I said, CBT is very flexible. So I bring assertiveness training. You saw that mentioned in some of the forms of CBT. So I get people to actually reflect on their own belief systems. I get them to reflect on effective communication, like making I statements. Instead of you this, you that, you the other, right, okay, this is what I want from the situation. This is my assertive bill of rights for myself. This is what I would like to ask from you, and also understand that you won't necessarily get what you want from other people. You know, Virginia Satir, who I'm a great fan of, and I've done Satir training as well. She's one of the 3 therapists that NLP was built on her work. Absolutely astounding, brilliant woman. And the first one to bring in this idea of systemic therapy, that you look at the family, you look at the situation, the society, the whole thing. But at the end of the day, she says, we each have our own dreams, our own hopes, our own yearnings. And whilst we can learn to express to other people what these are and to ask them for the support, that does not mean that they're responsible for our happiness. They're not responsible for making us happy. We have to learn to do that for ourselves. So there are general things which you say quite rightly, you learn in CBT about changing this, that, and the other. What I love about CBT, and the way certainly I teach it, is to make it very specific tools to do that. That someone goes off and they notice, and they come back and they reflect on what they've noticed. What hasn't worked for them? What has? Which techniques and tools that I gave them to go away and try, which ones did it for them? As you said, each person's an individual, and at the same time, there are certain universals about human emotions that seem to be pretty much across all cultures. I studied and trained with Dr. Paul Ekman's system. He's the godfather of guru of emotional intelligence, and the guy that discovered the 7, now working on an 8th universal facial expression. And one of the things he says is, you know, you can go to Africa, you can go to downtown New York, you can go to Japan, and you'll find there'll be some cultural overlays, but there are certain core things about humans that we seem to have in common as our humanity. And that's one of the things I think is great about being a therapist. Yes, I'm not saying don't be culturally aware and sensitive, but there are certain things that just seem to work for people. You know, unless they've got really bad systemic brain damage of some sort, as long as they're functioning human being, and believe me, my husband has worked with far more extreme physical disabilities than I have. He worked at one time doing workshops and things for a charity, national charity in the UK, one of the biggest. And there are people who are blind, deaf, schizophrenic, you name it. And you think, how on earth? And yet these people can be helped with the right kind of support, the right kind of help. Their lives can be made more meaningful and happier and have a better quality of life. So I'm all about what works, what's practical, and I have an open mind to lots of things. But over the years, I found that, that there are some things that are far more effective. And for me, if you ask me personally, I think the combination of cognitive behavioural therapy, along with neurolinguistic programming and understanding how language works, with clinical hypnotherapy, how the subconscious works, and bring into that, obviously there are a number of other tools and techniques. You can, for the vast majority of clients, you will have them turn their life around in a matter of weeks rather than months. And we have so many testimonials to that effect. If I briefly share with you one case that Dr. Cato had, was a young man in his 20s. And he had been depressed since he was 14. By the time he was, or maybe even 12, anyway, that's right, 12. By the time he was 14, they took him off to the doctor. Between the age of 14 and 16, you couldn't say this guy didn't get any support. He did. He had a psychiatrist, he had a psychologist, he had a counsellor, he got a lot of input from the National Health Service in the UK. He was put on medication at the same time. In that same period that he had all that intervention, both therapeutic and medication, he attempted suicide several times with overdoses, and when he didn't succeed, he jumped off a bridge. And it was one of those complete miracles that he survived. He jumped off a suspension bridge. He was in hospital for months. He'd broken nearly every bone in his body. He had to have dozens of plastic surgery operations because he'd just damaged his face so badly. And he worked with David Cato for 6 weeks. And at the end of that 6 weeks, he decided to go back to college and to sort his life out. And if you looked at his list of suicidal ideation, depression, low self-image, blah, 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 it's almost miraculous. And this is filled in the client's own terms. So I'm not saying you'll always get 100% and 99%, but you'll get very high success rates by applying skills that work and that are effective and being client-centered. As I was glad to hear you say earlier, you know, each person's an individual. So you need to adapt the therapy to the individual. I don't go around saying, oh, a resistant client or a client that's not doing their bit. I mean, sure, if a client doesn't do their bit, I'll call them out. You say you want to change, but you haven't done any of the exercises you agreed to do. How do you think the change is going to happen? So it is very much a 50-50 responsibility, but my job as a therapist is to have the experience to know when to nudge them along, when to encourage them, when to let them just kind of take it easy, let it all sink in. And their job is to go out and make their life different, make their life change for the better, and love and accept themselves and just start to have a good life. Now, does this mean we're not going to suffer from pain and loss? Of course not. I'm quite happy to share with you, my family was supposed to be coming over to join us in August for 3 weeks. We haven't seen them for a year and a half. Normally we see each other several times every year. And I realized pretty late in the day that they weren't actually going to come. And I was absolutely brokenhearted. I was grieving. I was just in total grief state for several weeks over that, processing that. Now, does that mean that, oh, I don't practice what I preach? No, I do practice what I preach. And I actually I was doing my happiness diary, I was doing meditation and so on. And then I gave myself permission to just go into a state of accepting that grief and that pain of loss, of not seeing my family, not knowing whether I'll see my youngest granddaughter again physically, whether I ever will, who knows, with what's going on in the world. And so I had, again, back to that word, sorry to repeat it, but resilience. I have developed resilience, which means that when things go badly, when they don't go the way that they want, I have an understanding of myself, I have strategies, I have tools that I can use, and that's what I teach my clients and I teach my students to do. And then they really enjoy their work because they feel they're making a difference to people going through a pretty hard time, as many of us are at the moment, in terms of our social needs, our needs for family, our needs for our loved ones, but also our ability to develop resilience. I hope that answers your question, but as I said, when you're looking to other people to do the change, first thing is do the change yourself, and then if the people are ready to change, often they will start to change because they can see a difference in you and they can see, wow, I'll have some of that too. Does that answer your question sufficiently?
Yes, thanks a lot.
You're very welcome. Okay.
Can I have one more question?
Yeah, go ahead.
I can see Lord Ganesha behind your left hand side.
Yes. This is the same granddaughter I was telling you about in Switzerland. We've given her what she got. She's had a number of she's got Namaste. She's got little Buddhist monks. She's got a Tibetan family. She's got different kinds of gods and goddesses. She's got, and this one we haven't physically given her. So we had Ganesha here. So we told her the story of Ganesha, and recently, and we had a book that we got, and so she got to meet Ganesha. And then we also told her the story of the last one we told, I think it was last week, was the story of Rama and Sita, and the story of Diwali. We're going to tell her again in October. So she got to see that, and she's got Hanuman the monkey with her. We actually managed to get, the previous time we saw her, we gave her Hanuman the monkey. So since then, we've been collecting some other things, because we like to have things from around the world, you know, from cultures, from different religions, different backgrounds, so that she can relate to these things. Because to me, do you know what she said about the story of Hanuman? Sorry, not Hanuman, about Ganesha. When she heard the story of Ganesha, her mum said to her, she'll be 5 in December, by the way, she's quite young still. She said, what did you think of the story? Because it was written as a children's story, but as you know, it's a pretty gory story too. Some of these old Indian myths and legends are pretty wild. And she said, it was a bit violent, but it was good. She also has a dragon, by the way, who's not in the room, so I can't show you, Aurora, who's this beautiful little plush dragon. And so now, because we can't have her here and see her, we take the dragon out. So lots of places we go, if we go to a restaurant, or we go to visit a farm or visit friends, Aurora comes along and we take pictures and videos. We make out she's flying, you know, we do all this stuff so that we have a sense that we can still tell stories, even though it's having to be on Zoom and there's no actual hugs. It's a bit frustrating because little ones like to have physical touch, but it doesn't mean we keep up that relationship with her. So storytelling is a very powerful thing. And by the way, I'm talking about my personal life, but in my work with clients, I use stories and metaphors a lot, depending on obviously what their culture and their religion is. And I find that helps them, because we know the power of prayer. Whether or not Skinner says it's all just in our minds, doesn't matter. It gives people a sense of hope. If things give people a sense of hope, then that is a big part of the way forward, if that makes sense to you.
Yes, definitely. I totally agree.
I also have a laughing monkey there, which is for the non-secular type. And this monkey, when I train with props, how you can use props. And so someone says to me, I can't laugh, I can't smile, I haven't laughed or smiled for years, there's no way I can do it. And you know, sometimes rather than me say, oh, what you can and can't do and everything, I say, oh, is that really, that's the case? And so then I might get my laughing monkey out, and this is my CBT laughing monkey. Now he just rolls around on the floor. Now, obviously, if someone has just had a bereavement, I'm not going to be doing this, right? But I'm talking about people where they're stuck in complicated grief, where for years they're still recycling the pain and all of that. Sometimes they need a little bit of something to get them out of that, and to start realizing that they still have that inner child that can play. And does it mean we don't have grief? That with Jennifer was on earlier. You know, grieving isn't just someone dying. It's a loss of health. When I lost my mobility some years ago and ended up having to have hip replacement, it's a major loss. There's also a death. You know, my mom passed away 6 years ago. 6 years ago now, when she was 96. I was still thinking about her on her birthday, and I was still putting her in light and all the rest of it. So these things, being human, doesn't mean we go around with a plastic smiley face on like the Dubai police headquarters, you know. I find that a bit spooky, actually. A big yellow face with a big smile, and that's where you're going to pay your traffic fines or get in trouble, you know. Ministry of Happiness. No, to me, we have human emotions. It's a question of, can we live in balance with our emotions? Can we cope with the times when we're under big stress? And can we actually celebrate and enjoy the times when we have the good emotions? So my approach is very different from, as I said, a kind of a, this is CBT, this is what you do. I bring CBT into it, but I bring in a lot of other things as well, because again, that's what makes each therapist good at what they do. Play therapy, when working with not only kids, but with adults, getting people to choose their own symbols of what means something to them. So yeah, all of these are part of how I teach CBT. I've been taught CBT the conventional way, and it can be a bit dry when it's taught that way, in my opinion. So it's important to get people to realize, especially going from the thought, the thinking, into the feeling, because feeling isn't in your head. When someone says to me, oh, you know, I say, where are you feeling that unhappiness, that heaviness? No, you're not feeling it there. Where do you actually feel unhappy? When you Sad when you lost someone you love. Where do you feel it? Immediately, of course, it's on the heart center. That's where we feel. And throw this in case you psychology students don't know this already. Let me ask you, actually, see if you are on your toes on this one. Where do we store the majority of serotonin in our body, the happy hormone? Where do we store it in our body? Now we talk about brain chemistry and hormones. No. In the gut. In the gut, in the digestive system. 80% of the serotonin is stored in your gut. This is why, again, you need to have some understanding of people like Bruce Lipton, the biology of belief. You know, our bodies and our heads are not separate. We live as if we live in this world up here. I call it the super duper neck-top computer, but our emotions are in our body. They're in motion. That's why they're called emotion. They move around in our body, and we have organs. And those organs, again, in the Chinese system, you know, I think it's got a lot in common. Some of the Ayurvedic, some of the old system, Unani and so on, they have a lot of wisdom in them. Yeah, okay, they didn't understand certain things, but certain things they did. One of those is that emotions are in the human body. And if a person is very unhappy, they can die of unhappiness. Okay, the technical cause might be their heart failed or they got cancer and they didn't recover. But people's emotions make a huge difference to how they feel. Again, this is why a therapist needs to be able to see that person and their potential and help them to build on that potential and not give them a label. You know, oh yeah, you've got borderline personality disorder, or you've got generalized anxiety disorder, blah, blah, blah. I mean, you know, we have to write certain things down sometimes if we're doing signing people off medically speaking, but I try and keep it as general as possible, because for me, therapy is about helping the person to find their own inner resources and build on those, because we've all got them, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't be dead. So you've discovered some of my props, some of what I use with my clients. Anyone else got any questions? Okay, so if no one's got any questions, I will let you all go. I'll say thank you very much for attending and for participating and letting me have a look at your faces from time to time. And if you have any friends or any colleagues in the field, please let them know. I'm saying this because the course we're running in October over 2 weekends, there's a weekend and a gap weekend and then another weekend. That short course, which is suitable for people who are already working in some way in the caring or health professionals, could be medic, could be coaching, could be anything. That's the last one I have planned for this year. I usually only run them 3-4 times a year. So that's the last one that will be run this year. And they're doing the special reduction on it after, I think it's Thursday this week, then it will just be the standard price. And that will be the last one. I do one follow-up for people interested in eating disorders and OCD using CBT and other modalities, but I'm not sure if I'm going to run that one. If I do, it might be November or it will be next year. So just as I said, put the word out there, because there's nobody else teaching this course or this qualification at the moment in the Middle East. And so if you're in Lebanon or anywhere else, that's great, but anywhere where you can manage the Middle East time zone, because we're actually on the same time zone as the UK. But when I teach, I have to start at 8 in the morning and finish at 3 in the afternoon or 4 in the afternoon, because most of our client group has been in the Middle East and GCC for some time. So last chance, if there's anything. If not, I'm gonna love you and leave you and say thank you again for attending, and hope to hear with you. Any other webinars we do on this or other topics that you're interested in, please feel free to join. Thank you for that, Martina, and Jennifer also, and Divya. So those that stuck it out to the end, well done, and hope to see you again sometime soon. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
You're welcome.